All right, everybody, it's 3 o'clock, so it is time to go across the pond. We are now going to be talking with a panel of exchange builders. They are going to talk to us about how different countries, different continents, various cultures, regulatory environments can impact market usefulness of information markets like prediction markets. The moderator is the legendary Patrick Young, author, exchange executive, prediction market pioneer. And actually, I've had the honor of attending and, in fact, speaking at a couple of Patrick's own conferences in years past, the Young Markets series in exotic locales like Transylvania and Poland. And Patrick, I have to apologize that I'm not hosting you anywhere more exotic than my own home office, but I am absolutely delighted that you're here and leading this panel. So I really want you to just take it away.
Thank you very much, Flip. It's a pleasure to be with you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you also to our panelists for joining today. My name is Patrick L. Young. Yes, I was the author of actually the original best-selling fintech book in 1999, Capital Market Revolution, which talked in a couple of pages about the whole concepts of prediction markets and other things. Little did I know at that time that, in fact, the good folks of Betfair were busily coding Flutter and Betfair in their own bedrooms at that point in time. They weren't in lockdown. They just didn't have a big budget. But at the same time, we're going to talk today mostly on the political side of things. And thank you very much, Flip, for this invitation. It's a delight to see you, albeit virtually, during the course of this evening's event, because, of course, it is now the evening in Europe. Let's look at, well, politics. Take it back to one of the earliest and most interesting instances I can think of a political prediction market, and that was pure old-fashioned bookmaker betting. 1973, the Isle of Ely by-election in Cambridgeshire, up near Cambridge University, which you may have heard of, ladies and gentlemen. At that point in time, the leading TV chef, I mean, it's hard to believe looking back and posterity. The leading TV chef of the United Kingdom, Clement Freud, was the candidate for the Liberal Party. He started the by-election campaign at 33-1. By the time it came to the polling day, he was 5-1 and indeed won the seat. Notably, the Daily Telegraph newspaper at the time reported the momentum is with Freud in this campaign. Why was the momentum with him against the Conservative candidate? Well, it transpired some years later. He'd been leaving £300 bets at various betting shops across the constituency as he'd been doing his different events and speeches for the whole campaign. Thus, in many ways, we have a legendary moment in the history of political betting. However, my guests today on this panel, I believe, know a great deal more about this topic than I do, and that's why I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Shaddick. He's the head of politics betting at Ladbrokes Coral Group. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you're in the United States of America, you may never have heard of Ladbrokes Coral Group, but they are a massive online and particularly chain of betting shops throughout the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and indeed elsewhere. Life simply would not be the same on the high street without them, which shows, I suppose, in many ways, a differentiation between the United Kingdom, where even members of the royal family enjoy having a flutter once in a while on the horse races and elsewhere. I'm also joined today by Sarbjit Bakhshi. He is the head of political markets at Smarkets, which is an interesting platform that has grown in these days. As Flip mentioned briefly, I was a co-founder of Intrade GSX back in the day, in the late 1990s, and it's exciting to hear about what's been going on in their world. So let's move, first of all, to Matthew. Matthew, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about how you got into the business of political betting, because I know you've been pretty much a lifelong career with Ladbrokes and Coral.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I've been working for Ladbrokes for about 20 years. I initially started there because I knew a lot about horse racing. But I found my way into the political betting job. That's been pretty much my full-time occupation for the last 10 years or so. Although the first big election I traded for Ladbrokes was the 2008 presidential election. And I come from an academic background of political science and statistics, so it's kind of worked out quite well for me in that respect. And as you say, Ladbrokes and Corals are essentially a sports book, as Americans would recognize them, rather than an exchange or a prediction market, which Sarbjit can talk a bit more about.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And Sarbjit, tell us, how did you manage to come to the world of Smarkets and the political betting exchange? And hello, Sarbjit. Can you hear us? You can hear us, but we can't quite hear you.
Looks like he's remuted. Hang on just a sec.
No
Oops.
problem.
Hello, can you hear me?
Sarbjit, we can hear
Great.
you. Greetings.
Fantastic. Greetings. Smarkets has been around for about 10 years. We do political prediction markets. It's the passion of the founder, Jason Trost. We also do sports markets as well. We've been expanding our politics offering for the last 2 years, which is how long I've been with the company. And we've basically been going harder, deeper, longer, trying to find every single angle that could be in a prediction market and put it up for people. We've also made a big effort of trying to bring that out to the press more, talk more about probabilities in terms of percentages rather than odds, and really kind of get the message out about how prediction markets could be used in both political forecasting and political journalism. So if you've seen our product, which is available to view in the US, but you cannot use it as a US-based citizen, you will see that we have charts, we have a trading interface. We're a very kind of sophisticated looking prediction market, but we are run commercially in the UK. Lots of people make money on our site, and we are regulated fully as Ladbrokes are.
Excellent. And actually, just talk us through that. So we'll start with Sarbjit. What's the methodology by which you are actually being regulated in the UK?
So we're regulated by the gambling regulator. So we have a license. We store our customers' money separately from the main business. So we're classed as having a very high degree of protection. So that gives confidence to the customers that if anything happens to us, their money is safe. We have to abide by arbitration rules. So if a political prediction market is questioned by our customers, it goes to a third party, it is checked, and then we abide by the result. So all these things kind of act in a way to provide the customer with a lot more reassurance about who we are and what we are, and how confident they can be that if they put money on our site, how safe it is. And I think that's an essential part to kind of legal betting, and it's a good underpinning to providing anything like prediction markets anywhere.
Very, very much so. And just so that people understand, in America, the regulatory framework you have is the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
As far as I'm aware, yes.
What I mean is it's not state by state like America, which is such an excitingly dynamic situation, or one might also call it a dog's dinner, as it's Friday evening and we can say these sorts of things. I mean, it's basically Britain. You're regulated instantaneously in one large country.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for the US, people misunderstand the US and the UK because we think of it as a single monolithic country, whereas it's much more like the EU, where across the EU you have different countries, different jurisdictions. So every time we want to offer our services to people based in other countries in the EU, we have to be regulated in that country. So that it would be a similar situation in the US.
Yes, and that's obviously quite difficult because they're a lot more restrictive on the EU continent about what goes on. I mean, Ireland is pretty liberal. That's where trade sports was regulated, and actually it's very much like the UK, pretty much pro-business regulation of gambling and related issues with sensible regulation. But the continent of Europe is complex, right?
Yeah, yes, it is. We have a number of licenses in European countries. It takes a lot of effort. We have to satisfy all parts of the regulator. But, we recently got a license in the US, and we've done the same thing there in terms of meeting whatever requirements are. And, we think that there's a great opportunity for legal betting companies to really, who are honest, who are not tied to any illicit money, to really go through those hoops and get the regulation. Because, it's a better world for everyone when these things are regulated, when companies, users, and the government knows what's going on.
Absolutely. Very interesting. So Matthew, explain to us a little bit about your methodology and the way that you're regulated. I think it's pretty similar, although you're a sports book or a political book company.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as you said, Ladbrokes is a big, well-established brand in the UK, which has been going for well over 100 years. But it's part of a bigger group called GVC, which owns the Coles brand, some other brands across Europe. Licensed by the Gambling Commission in the UK, as you say, but it does have operations in most other European countries as well as in some other parts of the world as well, although most of our turnover would still come from the UK. But as you say, regulations are different in different parts of the world. In the UK, we've had 60 years experience of betting on politics, for example, same as in Ireland. Whereas still in some countries in the EU, Italy and France, for example, there are restrictions on people being able to bet on politics in those countries. And as we may get to discuss later, of course, sports books in the US, which have been opening up recently, are still exclusively prevented from betting on politics, with the exception of predicted, of course, which is slightly different to this situation.
Right, and that's an interesting point, actually. Maybe we can sort of quickly move into predicted just while we're talking about that, because that's a quite fascinating marketplace altogether. How do you perceive that, Matthew, when you're looking at it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at it because the main business we're taking at the moment on politics is 95% surrounding the US election. And so, of course, predict it. It's a very liquid market with lots of different options over there. I would expect it to be more accurate than similar enterprises outside of the US. And the kind of fascinating thing is that, of course, it's kind of insulated from the rest of the world's betting market ecosystem, because it only allows US citizens to play on predict it. And US citizens in the main can't access the rest of the world's betting markets for various legal reasons. So it's kind of insulated little bubble, and it's quite an interesting experiment because we can see some fairly divergent prices on some markets between predict and, let's say, Betfair or Smarkets, which are the bigger exchanges over in the UK and Europe. And I thought it was interesting what Harry Crane was saying in the first session. He's obviously a fan of prediction markets being a much better guide, much more efficient way of assessing the probabilities than, for instance, 538, who've got a bit of a kicking. But then you've got to explain the big differences between, let's say, Betfair and Predict It, two big liquid markets, which come up with completely different estimates in some cases.
Yes, it's quite interesting the way that there's no sort of direct arbitrage to manage to wipe those differentials out over time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there must be some people who've got access to both, but it would have to be quite a big difference, right, to take advantage of, especially given the rather prohibitive fees and commissions that Predict It currently charge.
Yes, obviously the commission issue has always been a bit of a problem, and that's also something with, say, for example, the Betfair model, where they're always charging you kind of 2 to 5% on your winnings, which means it's fine for trading within a particular market, but it's not really very advantageous for trading if you see two different prices on two different platforms, because the window of arbitrage has to be absolutely enormous. I'm going to come to Sarbjit in just a minute, but actually while I have you, it's fascinating. You're talking about this, 60, 70-year history of political betting in the UK. I mean, run us through a little bit of, how that's developed and how you've seen that over time in the history of, Ladbrokes, Corals and the other major players.
Okay, so until, let's say 20 years ago, most betting was conducted through retail betting shops, which, as you say, are a common feature of most UK towns and cities. Now, of course, a huge percentage of that has moved online. But for most of those 60 or 70 years that we were mentioning before, betting on politics was, to be honest, a PR-led loss leader, seen as a bit of a joke by people in the gaming industry, as something that bookmakers, operators couldn't make money on, always lost, or almost always lost on. And I guess it's only been in the last 10 years that companies like ours have started taking this reasonably seriously, putting some resource behind it, employing people like me and Sarbjit to try and run these things. And even though, I mean, the US election this year will be the biggest single event we trade as a gaming group, still, as a percentage of our overall turnover, politics is very, very small compared to soccer, tennis, horse racing, so on.
That's very interesting altogether. So, Sarbjit, I mean, if I can turn back to you, I mean, first of all, obviously, Predict It's a very interesting business. Tell us a little bit about your perceptions of that, because obviously they're in a very similar space to you.
It's true. Predict It, of course, are a university experiment. And one of the big things that you see between Smarkets and Predict It is the kind of whole look and feel of that website. It's not very clear. It's from a trading perspective, or so you were trying to manage your position on that. The site is laid out to just convey a lot of information, a lot of dense information in a simple way. With markets, you get to choose your own percentages that you can choose for probabilities and trade on those and leave your offer out in the market. There are things that are obviously missing from PredictIt. Also, PredictIt has the kind of limits you have on user trades. So I think Philip in a previous video talked about how that works and how that can affect prices at the end of the day when some trades are just cancelled out. There are lots of things that make PredictIt good, and that's that it's legal, it's available, everyone knows about it, people talk about it. There's things that make it less good, which are commission structure, fees, the way that the trades work, and the interface. And I think that those are the big differences I'd pull out between markets and PredictIt.
Mm-hmm. Well, I must say, I mean, I would compliment you. Your interface to me looks just quite incredible. I mean, it's as good as, Interactive Brokers or somebody like that. It's a really, really fascinatingly professional looking kind of workstation that you're instantly logging into. But we've raised a couple of times the things that are very, very interesting. You've talked about, obviously fixed odds, that's Matthew's, or at least odds, making odds is Matthew's business. You're talking about percentages. Walk us through a little bit, the argument in terms of, why the percentages, how it works. Is it not less flexible than, say, using odds, etc.?
I think that percentages are something that people from the political world will understand much more. And fractional odds really does come from gambling. I think it's much rarer for people who are involved in politics to talk about fractional odds. Whereas taking positions at different percentages allows you to get a better kind of understanding of where your position is on a political market, and allows you to kind of understand more quickly where you trade in and trade out. And there's we have all the things on our site, so you can look at odds in American format, fractional odds, percentages, or decimal, to cater for all kind of user groups. But I think for percentages, especially when you're talking to journalists and say, well, the chance of Amy Klobuchar becoming VP is like 34%. That's something they get immediately. Whereas if you convert that to fractional odds, some journalists get it, some don't. And I think also with communicating with the public, they understand it out of 100%. Like I'd say almost 100% of people understand out of 100%. Whereas if you bring it from a fractional odds point of view, you're going to speak to a very, very small segment.
Very interesting. Matthew, your opinion on that, because obviously you've always been much more in the fractional odds business historically as a bookmaker.
Yeah, I'd rather we switch to decimals, but there's a lot of inertia behind the gambling world to moving to that. All the same, it is a much easier, because historically fractional odds were understood by bettors in the UK. It's quite difficult to move people onto different forms. I mean, for instance, moving to an exchange model, there's a huge resistance from a lot of people to even moving that far, because getting their heads around the whole concept is very difficult. And I think that's the problem that PredictIt is going to have if it had any aspirations to be a mass market consumer product, because the whole concept of buying and selling at 15 cents or whatever is going to be quite a hard one to explain to your average recreational gambler. It's fine for your savvy traders, which I assume is the vast majority of their customer base at the moment. But I do wonder what will happen to that platform once, if and when politics becomes legal for sports books in most states.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, you look at even how Betfair evolved over time, and they then ended up actually producing a series of fixed odd books on the other side of their exchange, which appealed to a huge number of kind of convenience gamblers and speculators.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot underestimate how much different the demographics, demographic makeup, the kind of people who are probably betting with a company like Ladbrokes and Corals over here, that would be a completely different looking set of people to the kind of people who I assume are using PredictIt, who I can guess are going to be much younger, probably more higher up the social and economic spectrum, much savvier, much tech savvier. And that brings with it a whole sort of different issues about the kind of biases that arrive in betting markets, especially with politics. Because I can see some of the business that Ladbrokes takes, I'm pretty sure wouldn't be replicated on the PredictIt platform. because the kind of people who bet with Ladbrokes are completely different sort of people. You see what I mean?
Very interesting. And so talk about, you've mentioned twice, the US presidential election is going to be a huge event for you. What are the sort of demographics of people who are actually betting on that? Because obviously they have to be predominantly in the UK to start with. Are there actually a huge number of Americans resident in the UK or moving the market, or is it just the whole populace?
No, this will mostly be UK or European citizens betting with us. As we just seen on the chat, we did get a US citizen flying over before the midterms to have £100,000 on that event. But no, the vast majority of people betting on this are either UK citizens or Europeans. Of course, you would predict it would have an advantage from the point of view of how good its estimates, its implied estimates of the probability of things would be, because they have, an exclusively American customer base. And I do think there's an issue over here with kind of name recognition is a huge factor. So the amount of money we've taken on Hillary Clinton and Michelle Obama, for instance, to either win the presidency or be the nominee or be the vice presidential nominee, is partly a reflection of that, those people are so much better known outside the US, whereas, virtually nobody's going to know who Stacey Adams is walking down the street of London.
Yeah, of course. And actually, as we saw in the past, I mean, there was that chap, Barack Obama, who went on to do quite well for himself, and he was broadly ignored in all of the sports books until he was remarkably close to winning the nomination, if I remember correctly, in the UK. It's a fascinating...
I'll tell you what was funny about that election. I'll just jump in there with something I meant to mention, was before that 2008 election, when John McCain picked Sarah Palin as his VP nominee, there was a huge amount of surprise in the press, both in America and the UK. And in fact, reading accounts of that campaign on the Democrat side, they were completely wrong-footed. But they hadn't done any research, and Palin hadn't considered her as one of the possibilities. But she had been third or fourth favourite throughout the entire summer to be McCain's pick. So that was one good example, an early example of the betting markets picking something up that the press and media didn't.
That's very interesting. Sarbjit, can you think of any good examples where you've seen in past campaigns, any election, I mean, even the UK elections recently, where you've seen the markets doing better than perhaps the media have generally been predicting?
So the 2019 general election, we had markets on every single constituency that was contested in the UK. And from 3 weeks out, we were showing a Conservative majority of about 50. Which wasn't exactly right, but it was much closer than all predictions and all opinion polls right up until the event. So we actually had the result, to some degree 3 weeks out. But I mean, the fact is that elections and political events drive media. There's no point in saying, well, we're not going to cover this anymore 3 weeks out because it's done and dusted. There is a whole cycle of stories that need to go about creating optimism, projecting a kind of result, seeing what happens at the twists and turns of a narrative have to exist no matter what the information out there is. So it's interesting contrasting the coverage with the prediction markets, because our prediction markets will move on information they think is relevant, and they don't move when it isn't. So often when I see something alarming in the news, the first place I go is to smarkets.com, stroke politics, have a look at that equivalent market and see if it's moved or not. If it's not moved at all, I can just forget about it.
Very interesting altogether. And I mean, give us a flavour, because I mean, that's 650 different seats for the Westminster election, which took place in the middle of December. So, what sort of business tends to flow through each of those constituencies? I'm sure it's not uniform, but it's a lot of markets to run.
Yeah, it is. It was an enormous amount of work. It was very difficult. Also, just thinking about how how we should approach that and how we manage that whole process, because it's all done manually. But I think there is a set amount of like 15 or 20 seats, and then as narratives were changing about the Labour wall in the north, there was again another 10 or 15 seats where there were lots of independent characters in this election, lots of people getting media attention. And that was also a good indicator as to what seats we're going to see a lot of trading. Also, if you look at the more out there media things, non-mainstream media, they will often kind of focus on obsessionally around certain seats or certain personalities. So often there is read across between people reading non-stream media and people who are trading on the markets to kind of counteract what they think is the mainstream media getting it wrong or telling a biased story.
And just actually, I mean, a simple statistic, remind me, it's roughly about 400 seats in the UK tend to be essentially steady and don't tend to change hands. It's usually about a couple of hundred that are more the marginals, yes?
Yes, and when I looked into, because I basically then researched every single seat, okay. One of the metrics I use is like, has another party in the modern parliamentary system ever held that seat? And there are some, the UK is an old place. There are some seats that have existed since 1317 and where they never really changed hands in that period of time. So it's pretty safe. It's pretty safe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to go back to the Isle of Ely, of course, with Clement Freud, I mean, he was the first, that seat hadn't changed since 1950 to 1973. He took it, he held it for 20 some years, actually it merged into a double seat. And then unfortunately there was a terrible error of political betting because he was 5-1 on 20 years later when he actually lost the seat. And that was the only seat that went away from went to the Tories. It was the only Tory gain in Tony Blair's electoral whitewash of 1997. So that's very interesting.
But you see, that's the thing about probabilities. That's why we talk in terms of percentages. If you say that something is like say 80% chance to happen, people say, well, if you're wrong, your prediction model is wrong. But the reality is you're saying, yes, 8 times out of 10, it will happen. But 2 times out of 10, it will not happen. And if it's right, it doesn't mean that you're completely correct. And if you're wrong, it doesn't mean you're completely wrong. In fact, when you say 80%, you are saying there is a chance, a definite quantifiable chance that the thing will not happen. And people will, hear one side of that message depending on what they want to hear. But the more you're involved in this industry and the more you trade in this industry, the more that lesson is taught to you. And I find people who work in this area, like Matthew and myself, much more cautious than the average person on saying what is inevitable and not inevitable.
Yes. Well, certainly, having been through a couple of UK general elections just in the course of the last few years, it's been quite intriguing. What seemed to be incredibly inevitable one week turned out to be something completely different. So I suppose that leads us to the fact of, how do you see the market? I mean, how has your market evolved over the course of the last 10 years, and where do you see the innovation coming from in the next stage?
So you mentioned sportsbook. So we have a sportsbook product as well, based off the back of the exchange for customers who prefer that way of seeing odds and seeing markets. We see overseas expansion as a key thing for us. So we've acquired a number of overseas licenses to do sports trading primarily, and then when the legal situation opens up, to do political trading. And we see like a greater usage of our data as a source of information for people. So people should, like I do, come to markets as a news source to see what has happened, what is changing in the market, whether it coincides with their point of view. And sometimes it will challenge them. Sometimes it will challenge them to the degree that they wish to put their own money on to correct the price. But to see the actual debate happening on our markets through the prices rising and falling, and getting basically journalists outside to talk about this more and use this more in their research.
Very interesting altogether. Matthew, if I can turn back to you actually for a second. I mean, you've obviously you've mentioned already the legacy issues of being with a company that's been around for so long. How do you perceive the ways in which the political wagering industry is likely to change and move forward, and indeed how that's going to impact upon your company?
Well, I mean, there's been a huge growth in the last 10 or 12 years on this. I mean, I imagine that the amount of money we'll take on this year's American presidential election could easily be 10 times as much as we took in 2008, which is the first one I traded. So there is a lot of organic growth there already, but no doubt the biggest thing that could happen in this world is some states in the US allowing betting on politics, because then you open a whole world of betting on congressional races, primaries, governor's races, and so on. And that would make it a sort of a legitimate, product which might sit alongside, fairly big sports that we take money on as well. So no doubt that's the big development that we're waiting for, to see if anything opens up in the US.
in the USA, which is obviously, the only thing about that is though, I mean, we could have had this panel 20 years ago when I was a founder of GSX Intrade. I mean, we were waiting for the US to open up then. I mean, it seems to be the thing, it's always just about to open up.
Yeah, I think we had half an hour, didn't we, of West Virginia legalising it a few weeks ago, before there was some legal problem noticed. Given that Predict is legal and operational right now, it doesn't seem like a big stretch of the imagination that one state somewhere will take the opportunity to, harness the first mover advantage you might get from this. I'd be pretty surprised if we didn't have at least one place that wasn't taking some bets by the time we get to November.
Very interesting altogether. And so, I mean, if we're looking at this whole, complex of markets that you run, how does that work for you, obviously, because you're actually taking the risk behind those positions?
Yeah, so one thing that I think a lot of people might not realise is that a company like ours, a bookmaker, a sports book, we're not just trying to, as it were, green up, trying to make sure that we win whatever the result is. That's not our business model at all. In fact, I can be almost certain that if Donald Trump wins this election this year, we will lose an awful lot of money, and vice versa. And the problem for us is that if we just priced everything up to be give us the biggest plus EV position, have the correct prices out there, just take the money, see what happens, we will likely end up with a very, very large liability on Donald Trump, running well into the millions, perhaps tens of millions of pounds. And even though we're operating in the world of risk, it's very rare for a company like ours to risk £10 million, let's say, on effectively the flip of a coin, which is what we're looking at in this election right now. The prices are anywhere right. Now, we could lose that much money in a day if every Premier League soccer favourite won, or if a particular jockey won every race at Royal Ascot or something. That does happen. We do lose a lot of money. To lose that much money on one event is something we very rarely open ourselves up to. So that's a decision that operators like us have to make. Do we just avoid that liability by ducking the price on Trump, trying to lay Biden, which isn't that easy right now? Somebody did have £10,000 on him today, which is the biggest bet we've taken on him so far. Or do we take the opposite view that we'll just do whatever maximises the value that we're getting from it, but then at the same time taking a huge risk? So we'll end up somewhere in between, when we're sort of playing by ear at the moment.
Very interesting altogether. And actually, we've got a question that's come in that's quite interesting. Somebody's looking for a bit of careers advice. Where would you go to find work to develop a career in political betting? So, I mean, Matthew, you actually explain to us, because you mentioned it earlier, but you sort of elided your way into political betting. And if I seem to remember, you sort of thought it was going to be a part-time job on top of horses or something.
Yeah, exactly. I thought, this would just take a couple of hours a week up and be a nice little hobby that I could do while I was doing my actual job for Ladbrokes. But, I was lucky it coincided with an explosion in fantastic political events, not just Obama getting elected, but from the middle of the last decade, we had in the UK 2 huge referenda, 3 or 4 general elections. We had Donald Trump, Brexit. That created, as it were, a position which you could work in full time. Now, the things you need, if you wanted to be one of the few people who worked in this area, is some statistical background would help. Obviously, some knowledge of political science is good. But as I said, if there's going to be any growth here, it's going to be in the US. So you need to be someone who understands betting markets and understands US politics. That'd be the thing you'd have to concentrate on right now. But there aren't that many people doing a job like Sarbjit and I do right now. Even quite large gaming operators over in Europe tend not to employ a full-time politics specialist and just rely on, essentially copying the rest of the market and just middling their prices and hoping that will work for them.
Very interesting. I'm going to actually throw a couple more questions at you just while we're at it, and then I'll let Sarbjit have a go at the same ones. I mean, we got a question here. What are the biggest differences between political betting and, say, sportsbook betting or other kinds of betting?
Well, I mean, I think that the big thing for me is that there's the kind of wishful thinking bias that all human beings have, which you have to try and eliminate when you're placing a bet, right? You need to separate out what you want to happen from what you think will happen. I think that's much easier if you're talking about a horse race a tennis match or something where allegiances tend to be less strong. But in politics, that turns on its head. You know, there are so many people out there, particularly perhaps in the hyper-polarized world of the US right now, who view the world through the particular lens of their political allegiance, and that's going to affect the way they bet. So, you know, we saw it over here with Brexit and Trump. Those two outcomes were probably seen more favourably by the betting community, or at least the type of people who bet with a company like Ladbrokes, than the population as a whole, which kind of explained the kind of disproportionate amount of money we took on leave and on Trump to win, versus if you looked at, well, for instance, the bigger exchanges over here, which tended to be slightly more pro-Clinton.
Right, very interesting. And therefore, actually, one other question I'm just going to ask you, and then I'm going to move on to Sarbjit to give the same answers in a second. But there's an interesting one here. Somebody's talking about the finality of results. Now, it has to be said, I do think this, if I may say so, is much more an American problem than say, a British or European problem. We seem to be quite good at counting our votes. America seems to have had a history of various things from the hanging chads onwards, and I preferred their earlier stuff, obviously. But, you know, whether it's the hanging chads or the inability of the Democratic Party to manage to actually organise a caucus this year, or indeed various other forms of event, how do you deal with that sort of finality? I mean, how do you make sure that people get paid appropriately?
I'm just going to jump in there, Patrick, because I noticed somebody mentioning the Iowa caucus where Santorum or Romney won.
Romney and Santorum, yes.
Yeah, actually, that was my worst ever bad beat in politics, because I actually had a bet with Intrade on Santorum in that election. I think it was 33-1 a few weeks beforehand. And of course, he won on the recount, but Intrade had some watertight rules, which allowed them just to pay out on Romney, whereas the rest of the world, for instance, Ladbrokes, in that occasion, ended up paying on Romney because he was announced as a winner immediately afterwards. And then we ended up having to pay out on Santorum because our rules simply weren't watertight enough for us to stop that. And yeah, that's a problem. I mean, you've got to look very closely at the rules in a lot of these markets. It's actually not even clear to me how Predicted are going to deal with the probable lack of a Democratic convention this time round.
Yeah.
But I mean, in our case as a sports book, we can usually take the decision, if it's not too much money, to err on the side of generosity with clients and pay them out. But of course, one day we will get a situation where there'll be some dispute as to who was elected president. You know, if you get some kind of faceless election situation where the result is overturned a few weeks later, I mean, hopefully our rules will cope with that. But I guess a few sportsbooks won't have those sort of things in place.
Well, actually, remind me here. I mean, my addled memory. If I remember correctly, didn't Paddy Power pay out on Hillary Clinton or something like that before the last presidential election? Is that right? There was something like that?
Yeah, they did. That was one of their standard marketing employees, which is to pay out early on things that look like certainties. And I guess this must have been one of their most expensive ones. I think this cost them several £1 million, right?
Yeah. Quite incredible altogether. Okay, Sarbjit, actually, if I can turn those questions over to you then, order in whatever order you would like to. We've got somebody looking for a career in political betting and the biggest differences between sports and equally political bets, and then also that question about rules-based and settlement, where you can sometimes have disputed and indeed legally disputed votes.
So on the first question, I mean, I think we had positions at Markets Open a few weeks ago and a few months ago. I've recruited someone to do this. And so I can talk to that experience, is that I was looking for someone who's really passionate about prediction markets, passionate about trading, and can demonstrate an interest in politics. The person we got runs his own blog, 326 to win. He could demonstrate a great knowledge in terms of trading himself, of understanding how the betting industry works. And I think that kind of thing just put him head and shoulders above everyone else. So get trading yourself is probably a good idea. Start writing about it. Start quoting the people who employ people to run markets, and you'll get our attention. And I think that's the easiest way in.
Great.
The second question, I can merge kind of 2 and 3 together, really. The biggest difference between sports and politics is that there are less rules around politics than there are sports. And it's something that you learn day to day doing this job. And I think Matthew and I will have this, and yourself probably from back in the day, have that kind of concept of how difficult it is. The European parliamentary elections were terrible for setting rules because every country elected a certain number of MEPs, and the UK, being in the EU at that point, elected its own MEPs. However, there was an allocation for new MEPs based on the UK not being there, yet the UK was there. So every national government published the full list of MEPs that they would have if the UK wasn't there as their final result, whereas the European Parliament published the actual result. There was no explanation on the European Parliament website of what was going on. Of course, those MEPs now have taken their place since the UK left, but there was nothing official. And that made so many problems in markets. It's just appalling. I think that, one of the things that we're interested in is creating a politics API and saying to politicians and governments, create rules so there is more certainty. If you look at the growth of sports themselves, they came out of people who insisted on rules. So the Jockey Club came about because gamblers wanted to know who won horse races because it wasn't clear before. Football and rugby came about because one group of people said, like, it's going to be okay if we pick up the ball, right, and run with it. And one group said, no. Basically, only one guy per team can pick up the ball. That's how you get football. That's how you get rugby. We have political systems that have open-ended kind of approaches to how one sorts out election, what happens and when. And so consequently, when we are creating those markets, we spend a lot of time going through every permeation of rules and possibilities. And we put a mark in the sand, which is the watertight rules that Matthew was talking about, and say, well, this is how we are going to regard the result. The person who is declared on the night to be the winner. This is how we declare an election. Election has to take place on this particular date. If it doesn't, that election is void. We're not having a market on that. It's something that has only come about through experience of running these markets. We get quicker the more we do. And of course, if there's any dispute, it goes to the regulator. We abide by the regulator. But as these things go, people kind of price in the uncertainty of what that political event might mean into how they trade that event. Because we might have a market on a minister to leave their post, but whether they lose it through being sacked or resigned, those both possibilities are there. And some people might think it's only a market on resigning or only a market on being sacked. And it's these kinds of problems that kind of really underpin politics, and it affects, unfortunately, the UK, the EU as much as it does the US. Although when I read the comment about the US elections and the Iowa caucus, I thought they were talking about the last Iowa caucus for the Democrats, because my God, that was an appalling psychodrama in terms of political betting, where no one was clear what the result was. Even to this day, it's not exactly clear. And, all the variations they threw into that last minute, it just kind of really encouraged us to tighten up our rules much more than we had before and really, really specify. So it's interesting on markets. You can go into you can see the charts, you can see the trades, and you can see the market rules. Always have a look at those market rules to see how we've conceived of that market. And that's all bespoke. That's all driven by people with lots of political experience who are read. I'm probably the most regular correspondent with the House of Commons Library in the whole of the UK. They know me on a first name basis. What bill passed, what act passed, what amendments passed, whose amendment passed. It's just as bad in the UK as it is the US. I can't possibly say the US is worse than the UK.
Well, on that note, where we cannot possibly find anything different between the excesses in certain political terms between the United States of America and the UK, we've discussed today the quirks of regulation, the quirks of rules. There's not a one-size-fits-all regime in Europe, and it's very, very complex on the continent of Europe. I'm sitting today in the tiny nation of Malta, in the capital city Valletta, which has its own relatively liberal set of gambling and gaming rules, which are very, very different to, say, a lot of the other countries that are around on the continent. But at the same time, the UK, Ireland, as we've heard today from our panelists, do have a very open approach to regulating politics. It's fascinating to hear the story of Ladbrokes and Corals, which has been around doing these sorts of markets for over a century. Then we've got Smarkets, an upstart, but nonetheless one that have survived a strong first decade in what the panelists have been discussing is a very, very strong upswing of markets. The United States presidential election still remains the biggest thing on the horizon. And let's face it, in the course of lockdown, there's not a lot else to manage to bet on apart from esports NASCAR these days. So therefore, there's the exciting possibility of whatever's going to happen in the US election this year. It'll be covered by Smarkets, which you can look at if you're in the USA today. I'm sorry that in the case of Ladbrokes Coral Group, you may have to actually head over to the UK when flights are allowed once again and offer your bets directly to them through their various interfaces. Nonetheless, this, I think, has been a fascinating opportunity to see the basis of what's going on in the European political landscape, driven from the UK and also indeed the Republic of Ireland, which have been for a long time the most liberal betting environments for all kinds of markets in Europe. We've talked about Predicted again, which I know has been a topic on and off during the course of today's events. My name is Patrick L. Young. I would just like to say a huge word of thanks, first of all, to Flip for inviting us today. And particularly, I think what you may not know, ladies and gentlemen, is that these gentlemen who've been on this panel are one of the most established double acts on the UK political punditry circuit. Sarbjit Bakhshi and also Matthew Shaddick, head of political betting at Ladbrokes Coral in the case of Matthew, and Sarbjit, who's the head of political markets at Smarkets. You've made a great presentation today. Back to our conference host in New York, Flip. Here's hoping we all get locked down soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Sarbjit. That was an absolutely fascinating session. These last 50 minutes have flown by. There's been a tremendous amount of great information and perspective. Truly, I think some of the most unique content we'll hear today. And I can say that I've gotten a lot of very good feedback in real time from the participants, both in the Zoom meeting here and from those simulcasting at oldbull.tv. And one thing in particular that was an interesting topic I'm glad you guys covered on rules disputes and rules ambiguity. Something that all of these markets contend with regularly, and something that our next panel knows something about, and in fact may have opportunities to exploit in certain cases. This is our professional trader panel coming up at the top of the next hour at 4 p.m. So we will look forward to seeing you all back in about 10 minutes. But Patrick, thank you again for taking the helm over this last hour, and we will see you all soon.